We're on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph, approximately 9 lines up before the end of the Amud, and you'll see the line begins with my area. And the Gemara now is going to ask two questions on the Lashon of the Mishnah. Question number one is a question about what seems to be superfluous and redundant, unnecessary in our Mishnah. My area, the Tani ben Achalitza u'men ha'yibum. Why did the Mishnah have to specify both the P'tur of Chalitza and the P'tur of Yibum? Listed, it should have been sufficient. Min ha'yibum l'chudeh. And we have a principle called Kol she'eina ola l'yibum eina ola l'chalitza. In other words, if there's no Yibum, there's no Zika, then there's no requirement of Chalitza. Why did the Mishnah feel compelled to spell out that there's no Chalitza? If you exclude Yibum, then we understand that there's no Chalitza. And we'll have a discussion about this a little bit later, but let's go on to the second question. Oh, wait, before we get to the second question, the Gemara offers an answer to the first question. Itana min ha'yibum hava mina michlitz cholza yibume lo miyab. We only have a pasuk that patters up a tzara from Yibum. The Torah doesn't say a word about Chalitza. And now the Gemara is raising the possibility that we can separate between Yibum and Chalitza. They're two different entities. You can have scenarios, situations in which there's no Zika as far as the mitzvah of Yibum is concerned, and there's an impossibility, a barrier that prevents the implementation of Yibum, but at the same time, she does have a Zika insofar as her late husband died without children and left a brother, so there is a need for Chalitza. And what the Gemara is saying is that our Mishnah is now coming to be Machadesh, a tlut, as we call it in modern Hebrew, an interdependence between Yibum and Chalitza. If there's Yibum, there's Chalitza. If there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza. We didn't know that because all we have in the parsha of Eishesach, it says Litzrar, and that's the derivation of the P'tur Tzara, which means that the Tzara doesn't fall for Yibum, but it doesn't say a word about Chalitza. Kamash Malan, our Mishnah, by saying that there's no Chalitza, there's no Yibum, is establishing a principle that Kol Ha'ol Yibum Ola Chalitza, Kol She'ena Ol Yibum Eina Ola Chalitza. That Yibum and Chalitza are one package deal, that two flip sides, if you will, of the same coin. And therefore, if in our Mishnah there's no Yibum, then there's no Chalitza as well. But we only know that after our Mishnah specifies that. And from whence do we derive that Einochinami, if there's no Yibum, there's no Chalitza? So that's going to be derived, this is Gemara later on Daf Chaf, from the pasuk that says, V'haya im lo yachpotza ish lakachas es yivimto. The man decided, this is the introduction to Chalitza, that he doesn't want to take advantage of the mitzvah of Yibum. Is then the pasuk says, "We also yivim tacharel as kenim v'yomra bein yivami lahakim liachiv shem Yisrael lo yava yibi." And then, since the Yavam refused to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum, therefore he is going to be giving chalitza to his late brother's wife. But if there was no option of Yibum, then the whole parsha of Chalitza doesn't apply, because what does it say? Chalitza lo yachpota ish lakachas es yivimto. And then the Torah gives you Chalitza. Why is there Chalitza? Because he decided, he refused to be miyabim the Yavam. If, on the other hand, there was never an option for Yibum, then there's no need for Chalitza. But that's what our Mishnah wants to establish clearly, and to be machadish this principle that if there's no Yibum, then ipso facto there is no Chalitza. Now, yesterday we had a long discussion about situations in which there is no Yibum, but there is Chalitza. And Rashi identifies all those situations as suffix. We don't know whether she's an erva or a tzaras erva or not, then we cannot allow for Yibum, because in the event that there is no mitzvah of Yibum, then you're violating an Isur Erva. On the other hand, we have to assume the possibility that maybe there is Yibum and there's no Erva. Therefore, we need Chalitza in order to allow her to get married. However, there seems to be other sugyas that imply the possibility of Chalitza without Yibum. Let's just quickly review that. And that we had in Rabbi Kibeg. That was the case here on page Yud Gimel that we discussed at great length yesterday. Just to review the outline of it, that there's a sugya later on about a case of an Almana L'Kohen Gadol. In the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol, there is no possibility of overriding, in the case of a Kohen Gadol, of overriding what's a combination of Esei Velosase, because our principle is Ein Esei Docha Esei Velosase. In the case of Almana, the Torah commands the Kohen to marry a Besula, and at the same time the Torah prohibits him from Lo Yikach Almana. And the din is, the Gemara establishes that in such a case where she is an Almana L'Kohen Gadol, which means every case of Yibum for a Kohen Gadol is an Almana, and by virtue of the fact that there's no possibility of the mitzvah of Yibum overriding the essay of the Losaseh of Almana, therefore she needs Chalitza. But there's no suffix involved over here. And here's where we had Reb Shimon Shkop, again, just to reiterate that the principle of Kol She'ena Ola L'Yibum falls under two distinct categories. One is a case where it's a total exclusion of Yibum. There is no Zikas Yibum. And that's the case of an Erva. And that's going to be derived from Lo Yachpotza Ish L'Kachas, that there's no Chalitza if she's not Ola L'Yibum. And in that context, Rashi makes a distinction between Vadei and Safek. Rashi says that, okay, fine, you're telling me that she's not Ola L'Yibum, but what if it's Safek whether she's Ola L'Yibum? Now, we don't know if she's an Erva. In that case, she'll need Chalitza. Then there's a different category, which is derived from a different pasuk, that Yevimto, what does it say there? Ola Hashara, Yevamot Ola Hashara, and the exclusion here is the case of Almana L'Kohen Gadol. That's a separate parsha that, although there is a nefila for Yibum, but because Ein Esei Docha Lo Savi Esei, the Kohen Gadol cannot implement that Yibum, but there is a Zika, and therefore she requires Chalitza. Okay, that was just a very quick, short synopsis of some of the things we discussed yesterday, leaving out the Oneg Yontif, which took us about a half hour yesterday. Now the Gemara asks another question. Until now, the question is, why did the Mishnah feel it necessary to mention that there's no Chalitza in the 15 Arayos? Now the Gemara is worried about the sequence of Chalitza first and then Yibum second. The Mishnah says, regarding all the 15 Arayos, Pturos, Mina Chalitza u Mina Yibum. Chalitza comes first. The Gemara asks, Mina Yibum u Mina Chalitza, makes more sense to begin with Yibum and then get to Chalitza. Because the question of Chalitza is contingent upon Yibum. Whether or not there'll be Chalitza depends upon whether she falls for Yibum. So first tell me that in the case of the 15 Arayos, there's no Nefil Yibum, hence there's no Chalitza, because Kol She'ena Ola L'Yibum ain't Ola Chalitza. It's very strange that you began with Chalitza, and then you got on to Yibum. Inami, now this is a very strange Inami. Usually Inami is offering another answer. Here Inami is offering another question. Inami, if you'd like, I'll ask you a different question. Mina Chalitza L'chuda. If we would know, if the Mishnah would spell out that there's no Chalitza in the cases of the 15 Arayos, then for sure we would know that there's no possibility of Yibum. because the only reason she's exempt from chalitza is because there is no yibum. There's no zikas yibum. And she doesn't need chalitza. And we have this principle called she'ena ol yibum, ena ol chalitza. So if you tell me that she's not ol chalitza, then ipso facto, I know I can derive that she's not ol yibum. So we're left now with two outstanding questions on the Mishnah. Question number one is that of the sequence. Why does the Mishnah place Yibum before Chalitza? And question number two, why even bother mentioning Yibum? Why not just suffice by mentioning Chalitza? If there's no Chalitza, meaning if an Erva and Hatzara Pturim in a Chalitza, then obviously we would derive the conclusion, Kol she'ena ol Yibum, ena ol Chalitza, that she's Pturim in a Yibum. Why then does the Mishnah feel compelled to spell out that there's no Yibum? And now the Gemara introduces the Shita of Abba Shol. Abba Shol, he, meaning our Mishnah, can be attributed to Abba Shol. Now, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between Chalitza and Yibum. There are two ways of understanding that relationship. One way is to say, you know what? We'll give the Yavam two options. There are two equal possibilities. Let him decide. Let him flip a coin. Does he want to go through with Yibum? Does he want to go through with Chalitza? We have no vested interests. We have no preference. It's the ball is in his court. Let him decide. Abba Shol has a very unique shita, and it's counterintuitive. Abba Shol says that what we're rooting for is Chalitza and not Yibum. Very odd. I mean, here the Torah created this whole enterprise, this whole parasha of Yibum. Lahakim zera liachim. And with all the tears in our eyes that this man died without any children, and we want to be making zera, but says Abba Shol, I have a compelling reason to push the agenda in favor of Chalitza. Now, if we accept Abba Shol, we can answer both of these questions. It's killing two birds with one stone. Why? Because I understand now why the Mishnah wanted to mention Yibum and not suffice it with Chalitza, because the whole point of the Mishnah, says Abba Shol, is to give you a comparison between the two. There's a race, and who wins the race? Meaning, where do we put our preferences? Should we encourage him? Right? Let's say you're the coach on a baseball team. You know, do you want to tell him to steal third base or not to steal third base? So, what do we encourage him? We're the coaches here. Should we encourage him to go through with Yibum or with Chalitza? Now, in order to address that question, the Mishnah has to put both Chalitza and Yibum on the big board. Now, Chalitza comes before Yibum, which is paradoxical, because the only reason there's no Chalitza in our Mishnah in the 15 Arayos is because there's no Yibum. So why do you start with Chalitza? The answer is the Mishnah is telling you something about a different scenario, not the case of Erva and Tsaras Erva, but your classic scenario of Yibum. And you've got now a Yavam who has two alternatives in front of him, Yibum and Chalitza, and Abba Shol, the coach on the side, is going to say, go for Chalitza. Why would the Torah advocate in favor of Chalitza? I understand Chalitza is a fallback situation. We can't let this woman who's a Yivama in a situation of an aguna that she, the Yavam coldly decided that he's not going to be Yavama, and now she's suspended in midair. So the answer is we have Chalitza. The Torah gave us Chalitza. But why would we turn it the other way around and opt and prefer Chalitza? Abasholi di Omar mitzvahs Chalitza kodemes lemitzvahs Yibum. That we should advocate in favor of Chalitza rather than Yibum. Now, why is this so? Because Abba Shol is of the opinion that the mitzvah of Yibum requires lishma. Now, I'm not sure if every mitzvah requires the Shema. I don't think that's true, according to Abba Shaul. At least I can't twist his arm and assume that every mitzvah requires the Shema. But Yibum requires the Shema because the Torah spells it out. The Torah says that the mitzvah of Yibum is lahakim shem liachiv hameis. There could be any number of reasons that you and I could come up with as to why he wants to be miyabim his brother's wife that have nothing to do with the mitzvah of Yibum. And Abba Shaul is of the opinion that Hakone says Yevimto shelo l'shem mitzvah, elo l'shem for other reasons. Noi ishus, he gives a whole list. Hareu pogea be'erva, because if we start from scratch, this woman is his brother's sister, who, if not for the mitzvah of Yibum, let's say his brother left the zera, would be an erva of Eishes Achid. We're going to alleviate the erva of Eishes Achid for the mitzvah of Yibum, but that's only on condition that he fulfills the mitzvah of Yibum. See, the Chachamim never accepted Abba Shaul. They hold that the Torah will allow and overlook the erva of Eishes Achid for the ultimate goal of Yibum. We're not talking about whether or not this particular Yavam fulfills the mitzvah with all the requirements, and according to you, it's a requirement. That's not on the agenda. Our agenda is lahakim shem. But Abba Shaul is applying almost a rule like Esei Dochalosas, meaning I need that this Maisa, this intimacy of Yibum is going to be a Maisa mitzvah. And it's the mitzvah that undermines and neutralizes the Erev. And Abba Shaul is of the opinion that the mitzvah depends upon his kavanah. You know what? The best of all options is to advocate in favor of what? Chalitza. Chalitza will solve all the problems. Once you get into Yibum, you're in a situation, a red zone, a warning zone that there may be an Erev relationship here. Let's avoid Erev at all costs. Although again, it's very paradoxical because by avoiding Erev, it's very nice to avoid Erev, and I applaud that. We want to avoid arayas, but on the other hand, the cost of this is that you're undermining the whole enterprise of Yibum. I mean, according to Abba Shaul, was there ever a period of time historically where we advocated in favor of Yibum? And the mitzvah and the parasha of Yibum did apply practically. Did Abba Shaul make his comment within a historical context? And at some particular point, he realized that people would take advantage of the mitzvah of Yibum when they weren't at all interested and motivated by the mitzvah itself. Again, this is all the sugya of Abba Shaul. We didn't get into it yet, but that's Abba Shaul. But let's just summarize now how we've answered two questions. Number one, we now answer the question of why the Mishnah had to mention both Yibum and Chalitza, because the purpose of the Mishnah in doing so was to compare the two and give you a guidance as to which one of the two you should prefer. And now, the fact that the Mishnah chose Chalitza before Yibum in the sequence, which is paradoxical, is to teach you that mitzvahs Chalitza kodemes the mitzvahs Yibum. You sure it wasn't about Rabbi Gershon, maybe? About marrying two wives? No? It was about Yibum?
Yes.
Could be.
Did something.
Could be. So which is there still Yibum going on today? As far as you know? Sephardic Yibum? Maybe not. Now, if you have page Yud Gimel, I don't know if Mitch has one, maybe we have an extra copy. And we're going to need Yud Dalet too, but we'll start with Yud Gimel. You'll see all the way on the bottom left of page Yud Gimel, he quotes the Gemara later on, Kol HaKonis says, Yevinto shelo l'shem mitzvah, el l'shem noi, l'shem ishus, l'shem dover acher, for any other motivating reason. Maybe she's rich. I don't know. Hooray, who keilu pogem be'erva. Now, I don't know what the word keilu means. Again, we have to figure that all out. Does Abishol really mean it's pogem be'erva? And lefichach adifa achalitza be'yibum sheyesh bo chashash isara. Nechleku rishonim b'shitase. Midivrei Ramban Ola Shem Eino Mechave LeMitzvah Hareu Over Al Iser Erva Min HaTorah. So from the Ramban's perspective, cross out the word Ki'ilu. It's not Ki'ilu. It's a full-fledged, absolute violation of Erva. Umizeh Hochiach, the Ramban goes one step further. Shekshe Eino Mechave LeMitzvah Af Eino Kona Osa. I mean, this is really way out. Not only does Abba Shol discourage Yibum, not only does Abba Shol maintain that if he did not have the L'Shem mitzvah in his Yibum, he does not fulfill the mitzvah, and he's Pogeh be'erva, says the Ramban, a full-fledged Maisa erva, but moreover, he's not Konam. The mitzvah and its fulfillment is a prerequisite for the Kinyan Yibum. And the impression you get from this Ramban is that even after Yibum, he's going to have to give a chalitza. Because if he wasn't Kona, then she goes back to the state of Zikas Yibum. She can't marry anyone Lashuk, and therefore she will need chalitza. Ulefi zeh cholek Abishol ala mavur b'mishnah lahalon. And I look at all these situations here. The man falls off, it's wild, right? But he falls off a roof, and his, by the expression, his organ enters into her organ, and he was oil or onyx. Or maybe someone pushed him off the roof. And the Mishnah says he's kana. She is an Ashes Ish. Now he has to give her a get. Why? I mean, there was no Kavod L'Shem Mitzvah, therefore there was no Mitzvah of Yibum. And Abishol, says the Ramban, holds that there's no Mitzvah of Yibum, there's no Kinyan. Yet the Mishnah says later on, Kana. Now again, I mentioned the case of owners, that's the most dramatic case. But there are other cases. For example, Ben B'Shogeg, Ben B'Mezid. Imagine the man is not even aware of the fact that there's a Mitzvah of Yibum. He has no clue that the mitzvah of Yibum applies. He's a total ignoramus. Okay, that's fine. He didn't get an education. He doesn't know. And he went and he had a relationship with his sister-in-law. And in this Yibum situation. And the Mishnah says he was Kona. She's a full-fledged Ashes Ish. Why? According to Abishol. So we're left with a situation where Abishol is against the Stam Mishnah, which is not terrible. Abishol is a Tana. So now we have a kasha from Rabbi Chana. Again, we're going to take a shot at it. Oh, wait a second. You don't have your dal. Okay, that's a bit of a challenge. So what do we do now? Should we ask Steve to maybe, you don't mind? Okay, just I think it's always a good idea, to have the text in front of you. The only thing is, and I don't have the Gemara myself. Okay. Tell me something, Jeff. This Gemara, I don't know, I'm not familiar with it. So, Jeff, you have more of a classic Gemara?
Yeah.
So let me borrow it just for 2 minutes until Steve returns with the goods, the photocopies. Let me read to you the Tosfos on the bottom of Gimel and Aleph. It's a very short Tosfos. The mitzvahs chalitza kodem. It says Tosfos Hashda the Ketani Travayu. Now we understand why the Mishnah writes both chalitza and yibum. And number 2, shona chalitza bereisha. And he sets up chalitza first. Mashma de chalitza kodemes. Aval I lo havitani ela chalitza lechudei. If the Mishnah would have omitted Yibum, and just mention chalitza alone, lo avi mashma min. We wouldn't be able to derive any conclusion. So that again, just to summarize, is the way the Gemara, by introducing Abba Shaul, has, as we said, answered two questions by introducing Abba Shaul. All right, so we're looking on the top of Yudalid, and we're quoting Rebbe Chanan. Alo af im nomar shesover Abba Shaul sheyivum below kavod levitzei yivum ukemandi omar mitzvah strichas kavod. So Rebbe Chanan identifies Abba Shaul with the Shita, which is all over the place in Shas, mitzvah strichas kavod. Me'ach she'enu mekayim b'kaf mitzvah yibum af eno kona. So now he reiterates what we saw earlier in the name of the Ramban, that he's not kona. Mikol makom amayu pogea bi'erva lo mevur bekam konos b'mesechtim she'af b'bia she'eno mekayim bo mitzvah yibum v'eno konos es yivimto mikol makom eno over bal iser eshes ach. He tells you to look in a number of sugyas. In the footnote, he quotes a Gemara later on, Lamed Hamid Beis, with regard to Muberes, Shalabasofi Pila. Reish Lakish says, Eino Kona Osa Bioda Biibura. Yim Kol Zeh Eino Over Aleh Biiser Eishes Ach. V'chein La'alon. L'gabe Yovam Katon. Sha'af Sheinu Kones Yivim to Mikol Kom. Heim Mutarim. So we're seeing clearly that you can have scenarios in which there's no mitzvah of Yibum, and he did not fulfill that mitzvah, yet he's Kona Os. And how do we reconcile that with Abba Shaul? And we don't want to assume that Abba Shaul is against everything, the whole Masechta, every single sugya. How could Abba Shaul say that he's pogea be'erva, and yet in all these sugyas we find that he's konar, even though there's no mitzvah of yibum. So take, for example, the sugya of Muberes, right? She was pregnant at the time that he had a relationship with her. Obviously, there's no mitzvah of yibum. Later on, it turns out that she was not Muberes. I mean, she didn't have a living being, so she was a pila. And Reish Lakish says that he doesn't violate an Iser Eishes Ach in this case. So again, let's just reiterate the premise here of Abba Shaul and why this premise is so problematic. The premise of Abba Shaul is that if we apply mitzvah strichas kavana, and he's not mekayim the mitzvah of yibum without kavana, he's not kona. And the question is, because we're going to see in many cases where he's not mekayim the mitzvah, he doesn't violate the Iser Eishes Ach, right? Like Reish Lakish says with regard to Muberes or Sofi Pila, he does not violate the Iser of Eishes Ach. Even though, again, he wasn't the kind of mitzvah of Yiva because she was a Muberes, but he's not Pogea in the Iser Eishes Ach. According to Abba Shaul, the minute I come to the conclusion that he was not Makayim the mitzvah of Yibum, ipso facto becomes an Erev of Eishes Ach. That's not so. Alo mevur bekama mekomot v'mesichtim the af the bia she'ena Makayim bo mitzvah Yibum the ena kono says Yibimto mikama komeno over bal Iser Eishes Ach, and this is called Hutra. So now Rabbi Chanan takes us down a very lumdish path, and he says the following: you have something called Dechuya, which means that the mitzvah of Yibum overrides the Yisur Shesach, and the Paul Yotze, the spin-off of that, is to say that if he's not Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum, then he's being Boel and Erva. He's violating an Erva Shesach. Why? Because we're holding Dechuya. However, all the sugyas of Shas seem to reflect a different sheet, which is called Hutra, that in the case of an Eishes Ach, the Torah was matir, the Iser Erva of Eishes Ach. And that's called Hutra. So if it's Hutra, we don't need Dechuya. Right? All we need is Zika Yibu. And then even the Bia is not the same mitzvah, that's called Hutra. Hutra means the Torah was matir, the Iser Eishes Ach. Whereas Dechuya means that the mitzvah itself is dochet, overrides the Erev of Eishes Ach. So Rabbi Chanan says, that Enochinami, we're going to have to assume that Abishol disagrees with all those sugyas that we mentioned. And he holds that there's no din of Hutra with regard to Eishes Ach Makom Mitzvah, Makom Yibu. There's only halacha of Dechuya, and therefore, so therefore, there's no din of Hutra. There's only a din of Dechuya, and Dechuya only applies when you have a mitzvah that could be doche a lotas. If he's not mekayim a mitzvah, then he's not doche the losas. It's really odd that in all these sugyas and Shas, there's no footnote, there's no mention. Hey, Abishol would reject all this. He would hold that if there's no mitzvah fulfilled, there's nothing to be docha the Iser Erva, and he violates Iser Eishes Ach. But he says now, I'm still in the dark. In Cain, Nimtza, it comes out according to this, that Nefleku Chacham v'Abishol b'tarta. There's a twofold machlokas between the Chacham and Abishol. Number one, Begeder Heter Eishes Ach B'Yivu, meaning, is it a heter or it's only a dechir? Begam, and furthermore, imu mekaymes mitzvahs below kavana lemitzvah. In other words, do we apply the principle of mitzvah srichas kavana to yibu? Harei l'chachamim lo zu bilvachi muteres lo af below kavana ela af konahu oso mekayim es mitzvaso bekach even without kavana. So Rabbi now, based on all these sugyas, he's forced to conclude that Abishol argues against Chacham in another vein and rejects the principle of Hutra in favor of the principle of Dechuya, and there's no Dechuya if he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah. Now that's a machlokes about the nature of Yibum. How does Yibum operate? What are the mechanics? Did the Torah say that this Erev of Eishes Ach is completely removed in Yibum? Or is the Torah saying, no, we can override the Easter because the mitzvah of Yibum will override, and the difference is going to be in a case where he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum. Like, for example, Muberes that we mentioned before. Or we'll have a case of a cotton shesh, a Yibum. So whereas the Chacham understood that when there's a framework, a scenario of Yibum, there is no erva of Eishes Ach, that's called Hutra, and that's regardless of whether or not he had the mitzvah of Yibum under his belt, and we check off the mitzvah of Yibum. Abishol, on the other hand, holds no Dechuya. There is an Easter erva of Eishes Ach even in a case of Yibum, but the Torah allows and recognizes the power of the essay, when it's fulfilled, of Yibum to override the Easter of Eishes Ach. And then Afkamim is going to be in a case where he doesn't fulfill the mitzvah of Eishes Ach. Now we have another machlokas between the Rabbanon and Abishol, and that is whether the mitzvah itself requires kavanah. I mean, that l'chor has nothing to do with the first issue. The first issue focuses our attention on the mechanics of Yibum. What happens to the Erev of Eishes Ach in the case of Yibum? And the second machlokus is how to fulfill the mitzvah of Yibum. Is there a requirement, a regulation of kavanah as a precondition for the mitzvah of Yibum? That's a whole new ballgame. That's a whole new independent machlokus. Very odd. You know, Bashol said one thing: I prefer chalitza over yibum. Why? Because he doesn't have kavana l'shem yid l'shem mitzvah. There, what develops is a whole discussion about the nature of yibum and the erva of Eishes Ach in the case of yibum. Is it hutra? Is it tefuyah? Because of now, Rabbi Chana wants to collapse these two seemingly independent issues and make them into one issue, one package deal. And it's Haba Hatal. The issue between the Chachamim and Abba Shaul, at the heart of it, is Dechuya or Hutra. The Afle Chachamim Eino Mekaymis HaMitzvah below Kavana. Even the Chacham agree that in the absence of Kavana, you don't fulfill the mitzvah of evil. Why? Because mitzvah shrichas Kavana. And we had jumped the gun when we assumed the Chachamim disagree with Abba Shaul Guf on that point, and they advocate Yibum because they're not worried about his not having Kavanah, because that's irrelevant. We don't need Kavanah as a precondition for the mitzvah of Yibum. No. Even the Chachamim agree that you need Yibum, you need Kavanah. Why do they advocate in favor of Yibum? And the answer is because that word tikuna, I think, is borrowed from more of a philosophical area of Torah. The afshe enkan kiyu mitzvah mitzvah avra. Ach gam bitol mitzvahs yibum enkan ki sof kol sof is kaim rotzon haTorah, and that's called hutra. Hutra means I don't need the mitzvah and its fulfillment to override the erva. What I need is an agenda to be mekayim zera liach, and if that agenda is relevant, then hutra, the Torah was marked at Isur erva. Would the Gavra, the Yavam, be Mekayim mitzvah yibum? Does he get bounty points? Is the ticker tape, checking off extra reward or not? Is irrelevant, because hutra means that we don't care at all about his mitzvah. What we care about is the yibum itself, which means the fact that now there will be hopefully zera al shem ochim. Now, he adds a phrase here, which you might underline. He says, Ach gam bitol mitzvahs yibum enkan. There's no bitol mitzvahs yibum. What does he mean there's no bitol mitzvahs yibum? I don't know why he needs that. That's totally redundant. He's already told me that mitzvah shrichas kavana bein le'Abba Shaul bein le'chachamim, so that he forfeits the mitzvah. Maybe it's a bitol mitzvah saseh. What he wants to say is that there's no bit. What? Jeff, do you want to say something? You see that phrase, bittul mitzvahs yibum enkan? That's a very strange phrase. But I think that you can only understand and appreciate that phrase if you read the next line. And that is that the purpose and the goal of yibum is the yibum itself, meaning that there should be this relationship between the Yavam and the Yavam that hopefully will bear fruit. And therefore, there's no bittul mitzvah. What he means by bittul mitzvah, again, he's not focused on the gavra here. It could very well be that if he asked me if the Yavam had in mind, oh, this woman's beautiful, or she's very wealthy, that it could be that's called a bittul aseh. He's obligated in the mitzvah of Yibum. But what he means is bittul aseh enkan, meaning that we don't undermine the mitzvah. From the Torah's perspective, once he's miyabim, that's a fulfillment of the will of the Torah. According to Abba Shaul, the Torah did not undermine the erva of and neutralize the erva of Eishes Ach. There is an erva of Eishes Ach, but rather, according to Abba Shaul, we're going to operate and activate the mechanism of dechia of essay docha losas, but that is conditional on the kiyum of the essay. Elo al yidei kiyum mitzvahs hagavra v'lo kavana ein zenechshav lo lekiyum is memela iser eshes ach omeid b'komo vel kain eno kona osa. Now, again, I don't want to, I don't want to prejudice you in any direction here, but just if I can make my own footnote, I find this Rebbe Chanan a little bit difficult. I shouldn't say difficult. I have no smashing kashas or objections, but I'm a little uncomfortable with this Rebbe Chanan. The entire emphasis of Abba Shol, let's go back to page Yud Gimel for a second. The Taimo, the Gemara says, "Zakonis es yivimto shelo l'shem mitzvah el l'shem noy l'shem ishus etc. Arei hu ki'ilu pogeh be'erev." Now, the thrust of what the Gemara is saying apparently is that we have to worry about an Iser Erva here because he doesn't have kavanah l'shem mitzvah. We're shifting the whole emphasis here from the formulation of the Shas to a brand new approach that really the main, I say, starting point of Abba Shol is the nature. It's Abba Shol's arguing against Chacham. Right? Chachamim are going to advocate in favor of Yibum rather than Chalitza. Why? So you and I might have said that either the Chachamim think that every man is a tzaddik and he's going to have the right kavanah, or they hold mitzvahs einam tzrichas kavanah and he could be mekayim mitzvah without kavanah. Comes over Rebbe Chanan and he says no, the Chachamim disagree. They're advocating in favor of Yibum because they hold that since there's a Yibum situation, there's no Iser Erva Veishasah. I mean, if that be the case, then I would have expected that when Abba Shol counters against the Chachamim, he should have said to them, well, you know what? I don't agree with him. I think we're operating here within the classic framework of Dechiyah, of Esei Docha Lo Saseh, that for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum, we go. Instead, Abba Shol says, wait a minute. Oh, his kavanah is Hashem Noi, his kavanah is this, is that. It's like Iker Chasam in a Sefer. The thrust of what Abba Shol is saying to the Chachamim is we are operating with Esei Docha Lo Saseh. We're not operating with, well, there's no Iser Erva because the Torah advocates in favor of Yibum and the Torah's agenda is that the Ratzon Torah is that Yibim Yavimar and Bimekim Zerel Yochid. And Rabbi Chanan is just completely, Abba Shol, according to Rabbi Chanan, is completely rejecting that whole approach by saying, no, we're dealing with Esei Docha Lo Saseh. I don't see it. Why did Abba Shol stand up against the Chachamim and say, well, he doesn't have kavanah l'shem Yibum? I mean, even the Chacham understood that he didn't have kavanah l'shem Yibum. That was never an issue. So he forfeits the mitzvah of Yibum. But who cares? Because the Torah, for the sake of the greater good of Yibum, looked aside on the Erev of Veishasach. Just forget about it. Discount. I don't know. I feel a little bit uncomfortable because on the surface of it, the presentation is, do we need his kavanah or not? Or does he have kavanah or not? Is he a tzaddik or not? According to Rabbi Chanan, that's just like secondary. That's not really what the machlok is all about. They both agree that he needs kavanah. They both agree he doesn't have kabbalah. The question is whether that's relevant to him. But conceptually, I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. Okay, so let's go back to Daf Gimel Amid Al. Minyana de Reisha Limaute Man. Why did the Mishnah have to bother counting 15? In other words, in 15 arayos, Pochos is sort of saying, I can count. Again, I don't know if I can reach 49, I have to hope for that. But I can count up to 15 at least. In fact, I'm holding at 44. So I got past 15. Not 3 times big. And this is a general question all over Shas. Whenever the Mishnah mentions a number, and the name of that parak is Kameshes Rei Noshim, it's always L'Ma'ute, right? For example, we learned together, you remember the Mishnah in Gimel and Shabbos, it says that there are 39 malachos, and then it lists all 39. So the Gemara says, what are you coming to exclude? And this Isi ben Yehuda actually has a 40th malacha. We hold there are only 39. So is there a phantom, erva out there in the dark shadows, and the Mishnah is going out of its way to exclude that category of erva? Now the Gemara adds another kash. Minyana de seifa lemute man. The Mishnah goes ahead and says, Hare elu pochos es sarosehem. Now we have to emphasize the word elu in the Mishnah. Let's underline or bold the word elu. These are the 15 arayos that pater up that saros. Lemute man. Is there another kind of itzara situation which the Gemara had in mind, or the Mishnah had in mind to exclude, and there would be evil? Now we turn to Daf Gimel Amid Beis. And the Gemara answers, Lemute derav uderav asi. I don't expect to get much further than this. This is going to take us a while. Because basically what the Gemara now is doing, and we've seen this over and over again in the last, how long we learned Yevamot? It's almost a month, right? That the Gemara tells us you have to know everything to know anything. So what's Rav? So Rav is a sugya called Soras Sota, which you'll see on the top line of Rashi. So I have a little diagram here. I don't know if you have it in your Gemara of Soras Sota. Actually, it's a pretty simple diagram. Some of the diagrams are very complicated. This one is relatively simple. So you have 2 brothers, Reuven and Shimon. And Shimon was married to Sarah and Rivka. Unfortunately, Sarah had a relationship out of marriage, out of wedlock. So that's called Zinsa. Okay, now Shimon dies, and Sarah and her Sarah Rivka fall for Yibum to Reuven. And Rav is going to insist that in this case, not only is Sarah excluded from Yibum, but Rivka, the Tzara of Sarah, is likewise excluded from Yibum. Now let's just think about this. Why should that be so? I mean, Sarah is Asura al Shimon, the late brother, because of the Parsha of Sota. What does that have to do with Reuven? And moreover, even if you convince me that Sarah doesn't fall for Yibum to Reuven because she's a Sota, how does that impact on Rivka, the Sarah of Shimon? He had another wife named Rivka. Why should she be excluded from Yibum? And our mix is coming to exclude Rav Shita. Again, the Gemara later on is going to have to ask the question how Rav will address this, because he can't accept Limuute Sarasota, because he holds that Sarasota is Eina Misyat Bemis. And that's where the Gemara is going to make a differentiation between Sarasota and Sarah. Fine. So I'll just read to you one line here in the Masifta, which is based on the Sugi of Rav on Daf Yud Aleph. He says, Sover Rav, Kishem Shehi Asura al Baila, just like Sarah cannot have a relationship with her husband Shimon during his lifetime. Mochen, Kishemes Baila, that Shimon dies below Bonim and Nafel Fnei Achiv Liyibum, Harei Hi Nifteres Miyibum Vechalitza. Lo Zubal Vadal, he af poteres est sarasa miyibum vechalitza. Okay. So again, we're assuming now, and this is Rashi Shita, most Rishonim, there's around, that it disagrees, but most Rishonim assume that according to Rav, a Sota and her Tzara are Ptura min Yibum. Now, when we say Yibum, we mean Yibum and Chalitza, because right now, before we introduce the Ra'ah, it's a package deal. And Kol she'ena ola liyibum, ena ola lechalitza. Now, I don't understand one thing. Is there yibum in a case of a man who marries a woman that's asura ola? Like, for example, Mamzeres or Mitzri Adomi and Moavi, whatever. Well, Moavi is not a good example. But anyway, we've said until now that there is yibum in a case of Chayvei Lav. The Kohen Gadol situation in Almana was the exception because it's not only a lav, but also an essay. That blocks yibum. But what's common to all the Mishnah, all the Arayos in our Mishnah, from beginning to end, is they're all Chayvei Krisis. Hence, they have a definition of status of an Erev. Mamzeres is not an Erev. That's Chayvei Lav. Sota is also Chayvei Lav. Lo yuchal loshuv lekachta, whatever the pasuk says, right? But a sota is not an erev. It's Chayvei Lav. So why should there not be any yibum over? So again, we would have to learn the Sugya Daf Yud Aleph to see how Rav derives this conclusion. But my question, I want to address the question of why, not why in a philosophical sense. I'm not asking philosophical questions, but within the realm of halacha, if we're assuming that Chayvei Lav fall for Yibum, why is Sota any different? So I want to suggest the following. And again, I don't know if this is going to go anywhere, but we'll give it a shot. There's a difference between Mamzeres and Sota. Mamzeres is paradigmic of any Isur La. What's unique about Sota is that the Isur exists only within the framework of marriage and is generated by marriage. It's the marriage relationship that generates the Isur. Mamzeres is asura for anybody, whether you're married or you're not married. You can't marry the mamzeres. And so too, mitzvahs and domis, whatever the different, I don't even know how many we can come on the list of chayvilam. But sota is very unique because sota is a result of issues, right? Because she had this extramarital relationship that itself generates the isur. So that if the isur is embedded in the issues, then it's going to have an impact on the zika as well. What do I mean? That when Shimon dies without children, the Parsha of Yibum would normally say that there's a zika to Shimon's brother Reuven as a result of Shimon's Isha's relationship with this woman, right? What would say her name was? We gave her a name, so we'll keep to the Sarah, right? So because Shimon is married to Sarah, now he's Keilu married to Reuven after he dies without children. That's the Zika of Yibum. So we're extending the Isha's relationship beyond the death of Shimon, and we're sort of grafting it onto Reuven. So she is like a Ashes Ish of Reuven as a hemshech, as a resurrection of a reincarnation of the Ishus that she had with what? With Shimon. And hence she can't marry anyone without chalitza. So chalitza is to zikas yibum what gerushin is to full-fledged Ishus. And why does she need chalitza? Because of zikas yibum. Well, let's go back to the zika itself. What kind of zika was there? There was some Isur in the marriage itself. Now, Aisha nicknames B'shlosha Drachim. One of them is Bia. So Bia is one aspect of Ishus. It's a very important aspect of Ishus. And Heter Bia is built into the very nature of their Kinyan relationship. It's a Kinyan Isur. But here you have a Kinyan Ishus without a Heter Bia. Because once she becomes a Sota, no way, no how is he allowed to have Bia with her. So a man is married to a woman, he's not allowed to have Bia with her. That itself is Pogea in the Ishus. So it's not just a separate Isur like Mamzeres. It's an Isur in the Ishus itself that's generated by the Ishus, and it is, what word can I use in English for Pogea in the Ishus? It is diminishing of the Ishus. Can you give me a better word? I'm looking for a good English word. I don't have it. It somehow impinges on the Ishus. So the Isur now, since it impinges on the Ishus, is thrust upon the Zika when Shimon dies. Now, if we come to the conclusion that this girl, Sarah, she's not such a great girl, right? If she can't have Yibum to Reuven, she becomes Ashes Ah. So we go back to the erva of Ashes Ah. Now the Sarah of Rivka, of Sarah, Rivka, cannot fall for you. That's what I think is going on here in Rav. Now, are we up to Rav Asi? Let's see if we can just fit in quickly Rav Asi. So again, our Mishnah in the Reisha tells us that there are only 15 cases of arayos that pater the Sarah, and Sota is not one of them. Lafuke Rav. Again, we're going to have to figure out how Rav learns the Mishnah. Uda Rav Asi. Now we're up to the second minyan that says that there are only 15 women that pater up that saros. And what's the exclusion here? The exclusion is saras islands, which you'll see 3 lines down from the top in Rashi. Now we've assumed, Rabbosai, until now, that islandess is excluded for Yiba because of the pasuk Asher Teled. Asher Teled Pratle islandess Sheni Oledes. Okay, fine. So the islandess is Ptura min Yiba min Chalitza because the Torah requires an Isha who can be described as Asher Teled. However, what does that have to do with the tzara of an islandess? And the answer is that once there's no Yibum to the islanders, we'll call her Sarah, then she becomes Ashes Ah. Reverts back to the original Erev. Now Hatzara is Itzara's Erev. So again, both Rav and Ravasi are basically saying the same thing. Namely, that if we have a woman call her ex, that for reason either this category called Soto or that category called Islanders, she does not have Yibum, and Mela Hatzara becomes Itzara's Erev because she herself is an Erev of Ashes Ah. The Chachamim rejected Ravasi because they think that the problem with Islanders is a whole different problem. Mekach Tos. No, if it's Mekach Tos, and he was never really married to Sarah, because unbeknown to Shimon, his wife Sarah turns out to be an Islandess, then she cannot pater Hatzara because they're not Saras, because there's no marriage relationship to. But on the other hand, Rav Asi is apparently recognizing the marriage relationship to an Islandess, and it's not a case of Mekach Tos, but she's excluded from Yibum by virtue of the Pasuk Asher Tele, and Mimela she becomes an Erva, such that she paters of Hatzara. And our Mishnah, by saying that it's only Elu, these 15 that pater of Hatzara, is coming to exclude the Shita of Rav Asi. Now, what we're going to see in the next part of the Sugya tomorrow, Mitzvah, is what's the relationship between Rav and Rav Asi? Do they both accept each other? And can we accept Rav without Rav Asi, vice versa? And then to swing back to our Mishnah with the same question that we've been asking, if you hold like Rav or if you hold like Rav Asi. Okay, then, so in Mitzvah Hashem, tomorrow we'll continue here on the second line on Daf Gimel Amud Beit. All right, everyone should have a great day and a secure, calm day for all of Israel.